This is story morning. I've really enjoyed listening to other old people's stories. And now we're down in the middle-aged range. And it means they're getting desperate, or they've used up all the old people now. So we're happy to tell our story here this morning. And I'll pray first. Father, as we come to you, we ask that you make our lives, our story, a blessing to others and an inspiration, as other people's stories and lives are inspiration to us. So we glorify you and bring praise and honor to you because of your grace and mercy in all of our lives, in putting together a story that we can't write, but you can in your great grace and mercy. I pray that younger people, all people, be encouraged and blessed. In Jesus' name, amen. We're going to kind of go back and forth with phases of life and telling stories, so it'll overlap a little bit. But to start off, Rita and our parents were in Kansas, central United States, about as close to the middle of the United States as you can be. And turns out that our families were in the same church, in the same community, though she and I didn't know each other. We discovered much later that we were born in the same hospital, and our birth certificates, our unofficial certificates, were signed by the same doctor and the same nurse, exactly 11 months apart. But when I was 4, my family moved over 1,000 miles away to Ohio. So we didn't know each other. Our families knew each other, but she and I didn't know each other at that time.
Okay, I'm going to read mine so I don't get off track. I was born in 1952 into the home of my parents, Ira and Clara Miller. They had both been raised in the Amish church, having been born into Amish families in the late 20s and early 30s. They both had 8th grade educations, and my dad worked hard at whatever jobs he could find. Then they left the Amish church shortly before their wedding and became Mennonites. 11 months after their wedding, God blessed them with a set of twins, a son and a daughter. And 15 months later, he blessed them with me. Mom wasn't very impressed when she found out she was pregnant with me. But it all worked out. They were good parents. I was born in good health, but when I was about 3 months old, for some unknown reason, I quit eating and drinking, and I became dehydrated to the point I was admitted to the hospital. My mother told me the story about it later, and she said, at one point, the doctors came and said, "We've done everything we know what to do." So she surrendered herself and her baby into God's hands and thought surely that was the end. But God, in his great mercy, chose to heal me, and I did recover. When I was 3 years old, our family moved to Arkansas to help out with a small backwoods church. Although it was at the request of my parents' local congregation, they received no financial help. So they had to find a way to keep food on the table, and it was a very depressed area. I never realized until much later in life that we were very poor during those few years. It was while we were living in Arkansas that my younger brother and another sister joined our family. When I was almost 5 years old, my grandpa Miller came from Iowa to Arkansas to ask my dad if he would come work for him on his dairy farm. Dad said he would, and our family moved to the Kelowna, Iowa area. This was a child's dream come true in many ways, with all the fresh milk and produce and other things that come from a farm. And a side benefit for me was having playmates right on that farm, as my dad's stepmother had birthed children right around the same ages that I was. So I had aunts and uncles that were about my age that we played together. For me, it was a fantastic 7 years. I enjoyed the friends I made, both at the one-room school I attended and at church. I also loved the summer VBS classes. Because I had started going to school before I was emotionally prepared, it was often difficult for me. My parents did their best to live out what they taught us kids, which made it easy for me to be aware of Jesus' love for me at a very young age, and I would often have conversations with him. After living in Iowa for 7 years, Grandpa decided he wanted to sell the farm, and my dad knew he didn't want to buy it. So we moved again when I was in 7th grade. We moved back to Kansas, where many of my mother's family still lived. My grandparents moved about the same time we did to the same little western town that our family moved to. So I loved life. I had loved having both sets of grandparents close by, plus uncles, aunts, and cousins. It was a good time. After switching from a one-room schoolhouse in Iowa to a large junior high, I then had to make yet another change in Kansas to a grade school with about 20 kids in the classroom, but various teachers coming in for subjects. And because of this move, and already having struggled a lot academically, and feeling like I was never up to speed with the other kids, I started getting sore throat almost every morning. In hindsight, I now believe it was probably psychological because I just hated school so bad. But after my tonsillectomy, I didn't have a sore throat to blame, and I still dreaded going to school. And I had 2 male teachers that didn't mind raising their voice, not just at me, but that's just how they were. And because my father was a gentle, soft-spoken, kind-hearted man, I was not used to that. It totally did something to me. I'd missed so much school and gotten so far behind in my schoolwork that it was finally decided I should repeat the grade 8, which proved to be just what I needed. That summer, we moved to a farm, and it put us into a different school district, and that became a turning point for me as well. I had a kind Christian teacher who helped me believe that perhaps I was capable of more than I thought I was. And the kids were kind, and I finally gained confidence in my academic abilities. After high school, I became a waitress at my uncle's restaurant, and I loved not only the actual job, but I loved meeting people and serving them. It was a job where I could thrive at being a people pleaser, which was a downfall of mine in other areas. A while later, another opportunity came my way, a job. The light's kind of glaring here. That was to take the nurse's aide training course, and after doing so, I was hired by our local hospital, a job which I also immensely loved. Instead of pursuing further education in nursing, though, I chose a completely different direction in life. Oh, you want me to keep going?
Is that it?
No, I thought this was yours.
Okay. I was born into that family, and number 14 out of 15 children, so that's me right in the center toward the front between my parents. As you can see, we were both born into a family culture that was different than ours now, but born into a family where a church community was what everything revolved around. I'd like to talk about my part of the story with a bit of a title, and I'll come back to it toward the end, and that is the pursuit of wisdom. And that doesn't mean that I pursued wisdom from early on. I learned to pursue wisdom, and the story includes God's grace in redeeming foolishness and mistakes and sometimes stupidity and moving toward wisdom. I was born into a safe and loving family, lots of smiles and laughter. A high level of discipline, though, in expression of negative emotions, especially expressions of anger, expressions of sadness. You really need to keep those very closely controlled. And so that was part of it. But a very happy family. I had the chance, as you can imagine, of learning lots of lessons by watching other family members. I learned to have a high respect for authority figures. My dad never raised his voice, never yelled at anybody, but he only said things once. And that's all it took. We had high expectations for work ethic. We had a high expectation of denying personal needs and even pleasures sometimes. And one of the fun things was that my younger brother and I, there were 3 boys at the end, and the 3 of us, and especially the 2 of us at the end, had a lot of unsupervised work time on the farm because my dad worked away, and during our growing up years, the farm wasn't big enough to support our family, so he and older siblings worked jobs, and some of the younger ones took care of the farm, quote unquote. And one of the really fun parts of that was that our barn, which was about 200 feet from the house, was right on the edge of a steep drop off into the pasture. So that land couldn't be farmed. It was pasture land, but it dropped off. So while working in the barn, it's very easy to disappear down into the pasture, and nobody from the house could see that happen. And there was a nice creek down there, lots of fun. And then come back and do the work when it was time, or seemed to be. I was involved in church youth group, somewhat a leader there, but typical struggles. And one of the things about those years of my life that really factored into who I am, and I'm not going to go into great detail, but I was always small and skinny. I was way, way short and way, way small for my age until I was in grade 11. Then suddenly things happened that made me think maybe life is going to work out better after all. So that affected me a lot. My education was different than hers. I didn't need to struggle in school, but other parts of my education that were equally important was the things I observed in our family, the things I observed in our church culture. And our church culture was changing rapidly from what you see in the picture there right at that time, and it caused a lot of discussion and debate in my family. My older brothers and sisters were making big changes from that culture, and the church was changing, and it was very unsettling for my dad. And my parents were very, very serious Christians. There was no question that their life in Christ was the most important thing to them, and family, loving their family was next. So there's never any doubt about that. And part of that expression was that every morning, 5 mornings a week, right after breakfast, we had about a half an hour of family devotions. We all moved from the kitchen to the living room, sat in a circle, we sang songs. My dad preached, and sometimes people debated him, and we'd pray together and go on with our day. But that happened every morning. It was during those times, and watching my older brothers and sisters interact with my dad. I didn't know the labels then, but I started to watch how mindsets changed. I started to see how fundamentalism compares with pursuing wisdom. And I started to see the difference between that. And my parents changed. They adapted their mindset a lot, and it saved our family relationships. But one of the things that was part of my development in leadership and in authority, in theology and doctrine, was debating things with my dad. After my older brothers and sisters were gone, and I'd debate with him about things the way I saw it, and sometimes you could call it arguments, but I learned a lot from that, and wasn't always positive. But one thing that I remember on a Sunday morning one time when we were hotly contesting some issue, and my dad sort of walked away, and I said to myself, I was maybe 16 or so, I said to myself, I will always be able to talk to my kids. I will figure out a way, no matter what my kids think or believe, I'm going to figure out a way to talk to them. And so that I didn't always perfectly fulfill that promise, but it made a big difference in my life. I'm going to hurry on. I was not encouraged to go on to school after high school. In fact, I was the first person in our 15-child family to graduate from high school. All the others stopped school early in order to work, and so higher education was not considered a good. Anyway, lots of reasons. But one of the things that was part of my plan was to volunteer somewhere. Lots of people in our church culture volunteered for 1 year, 2 years, and went away to do something. That looked like a good way to change my world and have an adventure. And so began to do that. I went to Rosedale Bible School for a couple terms. That was mostly just to practice being on my own and to have fun. And I didn't do very well at really seriously studying there, but volunteering for a volunteer place, I applied to a place I learned about, Northern Light Gospel Missions in Red Lake, Ontario. But a few weeks later, I got a letter saying they didn't need me. And so I ended up applying to an ecology program in California, and was planning to be placed in Sequoia National Forest as an ecology worker, maybe otherwise known as a tree hugger. I don't know what it was going to be. I had no idea. I just was headed for some adventure somewhere, and God, because of parents' prayers, I want to encourage you that parents praying for their kids makes a difference. I see that God intervened, and I don't know what our story would be like had that plan gone through, but 2 weeks before I was planning to go there, they canceled the whole program. And I already had my clothes and everything was all ready to go. They canceled the whole program. Within about 2 days, I had reconnected with Northern Light Gospel Missions and was offered a spot there. And I've basically been here ever since. Not quite, but that's how. I don't know what to blame God for, what to credit different things for, but God's grace makes a big difference. And so I ended up at Poplar Hill Development School, which is a residential school. And for 2 school years, I volunteered there, not having a clue what was happening, and not having a clue what the whole assimilation story was, and just doing my job and enjoying the adventure. And she and I had met, but that's partly her story now. Back to her.
Years before meeting Merle, I took to heart some advice I was given and began praying for my future husband. I had a deep awareness of God, and even though I didn't always follow his ways instead of my own, I always felt his forgiveness and acceptance. It was while viewing a Billy Graham film at a Youth for Christ event that I first heard the phrase, Christianity is not a religion, but a relationship, and it totally made sense in my heart. Having been raised in a very legalistic home and church, I was set free to follow Jesus because I truly loved him, and not because of the rules I'd been told to follow. Many hard lessons would follow, but I knew I had a friend in Jesus I could always turn to. I was 19 years old when my cousin Larry returned from Rosedale Bible College, telling me all about his wonderful roommate and what a great guy he is and how much fun they had. And he told me that since neither of them had girlfriends, they exchanged stacks of high school photos and each picked a girl's photo from the opposite stack, never knowing them. Then they put them up in their room and said, these are our girlfriends. Well, his roommate
I don't know who she's talking about.
picked my picture, and his name happened to be Merle Knisley. And I said, so what? What do I care? I'll never meet him. But I didn't know the connection between me and a lot of his relatives that went to my church, including one of the pastors, was his brother. I had no idea. And it turned out that the very following summer, he and his parents and younger brother came through Kansas, and we were introduced. And man, was I smitten. So we had a long-distance relationship right from the get-go. And finally, on July 13, 1973, we were married. He had already come up here, and everything was, when I say long distance, it was long distance, because when he first went into Poplar Hill, he was in there 9 months, and we had no phone contact or anything. And so we wrote letters, and I couldn't even remember what his voice was like, hardly, when he came out and finally called me. As I said, then after we were married in July of 73, I came up with him and worked at the school with him for one school year. Then in June of 74, we relocated back to his home area in Ohio, where we lived for 2.5 years. During this time, we became parents to Rhonda and were involved in many church activities, starting small groups, serving as youth leaders, and more. It was a full and busy and fun time. But in 1977, through a series of events, we both felt led to return to Canada. This time, instead of going back to the same place we'd been at, we applied to live at what was referred to as the Poplar Hill Mission, working on the reserve. At that time, the organization didn't require a degree of any kind, or for that matter, much of anything in the line of credentials, but we did have willing hearts.
Our time in Ohio was really, as she said, full and busy, and it was a big transition into a different stage of life because we were mentored and helped by a pastor who was different than the one who was there when I had in my childhood, and I worked with my older brother every day at a Ford dealership where he apprenticed me in auto mechanics. And so it was a time of learning and growing tremendously, and it was a time of reflecting on how life, what should be next in life, and where we go from here. And it was during that time in Ohio that I got my pilot's license, because I thought one of the options was to come back to Canada to fly as a commercial pilot, and that was part of what was in my thinking. But the growth and the learning really deepened our understanding and ability, we felt, to be led by the Holy Spirit, to hear Him, to set priorities in life that God seemed to have in mind for us. And so I consciously gave up the commercial pilot dream and career, and gave up the idea that I would ever use my pilot's license. But as she said, it's another story, but we felt really clearly, independently, that we were supposed to fill that particular assignment that we actually did for the next 10 years. And during the prayer and seeking God during that time, there was a verse where Jesus spoke to his disciples in John 15:16. And he said, "You did not choose me, but I have chosen you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should remain, that whatever you ask of the Father in my name, He will give it to you." I didn't know you weren't supposed to take scriptures, verses said to someone else, and apply them to yourself. So what I did is I decided to take that message to the disciples as one to me as well. And it's been a life verse. So our next experience in Canada was very different. Our next experience with Indigenous people was very different, where we, instead of bringing people into an environment we controlled, we were the outsiders, and we were the learners, and we were the ones who needed to humble ourselves and learn language and just be taught by people. And that was life-changing.
These were both satisfying and difficult years in many ways. There are 10 years worth of stories to be written about living in an isolated community with no electricity, indoor plumbing, running water, or gas appliances. In those 10 years, we had 3 more daughters. We would have to fly out here to Red Lake to the nearest hospital. And unlike some women we knew, we did always make it in time. I think that I allowed my own and other people's expectations of what a real missionary is supposed to do and be to cause a lot of anxiety. A lot of the struggle also came from wanting to provide the best care for my 4 little girls while living without modern conveniences or having family close by for support. After living at Poplar Hill for 6 years, we heard about an organization in Western Canada called IMCO and began exploring what they offered. We were able to attend their program for new workers on Quadra Island, BC for 3 months in 1983. And it was a wonderful God-given break for me and gave me new insights into the cross-cultural work that we were already in. And we made a lot of good friends through that too, and felt much more support that way. I can easily testify to the fact that I depended on my Heavenly Father during the many times of uncertainty. As I said earlier, we had not been given or even required to obtain any type of training to prepare us for ministry to another culture. So we did the best we could with what we had. Merle had access to a small airplane and was asked to make flights to other communities for various reasons from time to time. There were times when he didn't return as planned, and I had no idea why or where he was. Fortunately for me, he always did return safely. After our friend Wayne's airplane crash and death, it did make the reality of him possibly not returning home safely come even sharper into focus. I took comfort from my friend and coworker, Mary Jane Hosteller, when she laughingly told me that she's planned her husband's funeral many times, but Henry's still here. It helped me not to worry quite as much after that. There were many scary moments during freeze-up and breakup. We didn't have a land airport then, whatever. So everything was on the water, where I wasn't sure I'd survive. But again, we always did. And some of my highlights throughout those years included getting to help deliver 3 babies in the community. All 3 were related to planes not being able to get in because of freeze-up. And it was very refreshing to see God's mighty hand in those situations. In those 10 years, our family did have several health-related things happen that we needed medical help, but never a life and death situation. Having young children in a community where they were the minority had its own set of challenges. In the small reserve, there didn't seem to be many issues, but once our oldest daughter started attending the local boarding school, that was a different story. And that's, at first there were other white kids there, but then their families left and she was the only white pupil attending the school. And because she was allowed to come home every evening, it caused a lot of jealousy and problems, and she was bullied and picked on. So that's when I began, when she started grade 4, we began to homeschool.
Our 10 years at Poplar Hill were life-changing in so many ways, and the education that we didn't have formally continued on. And I did do some formal studies by distance learning, anthropology and things, and then later, after we moved back to Red Lake, we did some on-campus work as well. And so education did happen in different ways, but the learning, the working at language learning, the process of helping with Bible translation, not actually translating, that wasn't my job, but reviewing and reading and listening to experts talk about the challenges of Bible translation actually was a paradigm shift in my view of the Bible and my understanding of the human factor in how we got the Bible. Totally changed my world. I never thought about some of those things before, that humans actually do these things. And so that there is just an example of things, some of the lessons that we learned. I was pastoring, leading, planting a local church. No training for that. Very little knowledge of what to do, but I will say I was gifted for it. God's preparation, God did gift me for that, but we had little preparation. And so partway through our time, when adversity, when a different stream of Christianity was introduced to the reserve, and it became a very aggressive attack on the church we were part of. There was only one church in the community at that time, and suddenly there was a very aggressive attack on that church. People literally walking in and taking over the service. Imagine that happening here, just taking over. And it was very, very stressful, very, very, it caused huge levels of introspection and prayer and wondering what's right or what's wrong about this? Like, what do we do with this? And very difficult time. I actually had symptoms of heart attack during that time from stress. But the long story is that God spoke very clearly to me to say, I felt, do not attempt to discredit, do not even teach against what they're teaching. Do not resist it in any way. And I did that to the best of my ability. And people actually pointed that out later without me bringing it up. And I'll tell you the end of the story is that the very people who walked in like that and disrupted our service, those very people are good friends of ours today. And that's amazing. And so that's part of it. We worked hard to develop local leaders in that church. We came to the place where we felt that local church was doing very well, and that local leaders were very prepared and ready for us to move and for them to take over or to be there without us. And we made the decision for family's sake and for some of those reasons to move here to Red Lake in 1987 after 10 years there. And one of the hardest things about that is that those elders, when I would meet to them, the church elders, they said some hard things like, I thought we would just grow old together. And they said, why can't we just do this together? And later, I learned a lot from that, and it changed my ministry plan from some of those comments later on, but that's how we did it. And it was right for us to move to Red Lake. But one of the biggest tests of our vision then was when the church began to decline, and when the other stream of Christianity began to dominate the church community. And we still relate, we're still good friends, we still have lots of relationships there and go there on a regular basis, but that was a real test of the idea of what does success mean? What does it mean? I had been raised to be efficient and successful and to get things done, but I've spent almost all my life doing things that you can't measure that way, that you can't do that with, and it's been a lot of learning.
So we lived in Poplar Hill from April 1977 to March of 87. By then I was very overwhelmed with living in the bush, and looking back now, I realize I was probably on the brink of depression. I didn't know. I felt as if I was drowning and had nowhere to go for help. But I believe God's grace got me through. Well, I know God's grace got me through to the last day when we moved to Red Lake. We built a house and settled into small town life while still working for the same organization. With Merle's job description, we needed to do a lot of traveling to other communities, either to visit staff or go to meetings or whatever. And while I wanted to support him by traveling together, because I knew what it was like to be lonely and not see other women, men might come in to Poplar Hill to visit, but not very often women, sometimes, but not often. And so I wanted to do that for other ministry wives. It was always stretching, challenging thing for me. As I felt, it made it that much more difficult to fit into the church and community life consistently, and especially as long as we still had our daughters all living at home. One day, Jenny's mom, Barb, from her sick bed, told me I should be happy that I can travel. And
Hey, no, just kidding.
And she was right, and I knew it, but and I listened, and it did help. She was a good role model. Traveling to many different locations, whether Ontario, Liberia, or wherever in the world, gave me many wonderful opportunities to gain life experiences with different people groups and see different ways of living. And it was great we seemed to gather friends and acquaintances wherever we went. When Merle became pastor here in 1992, I felt very unqualified in my role as pastor's wife. Again, nobody teaches pastors' wives how to be pastor wife, right? Right, Lana? Then I realized that nothing had really changed as far as who I was. I just needed to keep being who I'd been and keep walking with Jesus. Being in this position definitely made me very sympathetic to other wives of pastors and leaders in what can be a very lonely place. I had a big struggle with whenever we would study spiritual gifts. I didn't like my spiritual gift that I thought I had. And when we were in a small group, and it was in our home, and that's what we were studying. One night, after a very good study and animated discussion among everyone when we were alone, I was very distraught by it all. To me, it seemed like the loud, prophetic teacher types were always able to articulate quickly all the right answers. And the quiet ones, people with the lesser gifts, sat by listening. And I often felt like I didn't really have much to offer, and I didn't think anyone cared. After the two of us discussed it, I admitted that I was totally dismayed at the fact that every time I took one of these tests, I always came up with the gift of helps. I don't know if you know what that is, but in 1 Corinthians 12:28, if you want to read it. So as much as I wanted to accept that as a fact, I just really struggled with it. And I don't even know why. I continued to operate in it because a lot was just my second nature. But I did it often with a negative attitude. And then one day, after we were eating lunch with some of our staff and a guest speaker, we were still sitting around the table talking when the subject once again turned to spiritual gifts. I thought, oh boy, here we go again. But then my ears perked up when this elderly, wise man who was our speaker made a comment. He said, "None of the rest of us with our gifts of prophecy and teaching, etc., can ever operate well without people that have the gift of helps." Well, you can imagine my surprise. He had no idea who he was talking to. And I know God used him to redirect my thoughts and ideas about the gift of helps he had given me. I started to embrace my gift and be thankful for the privilege of not only helping others, but helping others to operate in their gifts. God definitely knew what he was doing. And I'm happy to be able to use my gift in our marriage. My first trip to Liberia also changed my life perspective. I came back wondering how I, or perhaps our church, could do more to help others that were needy. It was through a chance meeting and conversation I had with the owner of the local thrift store that the wheels started turning, and today, Second Chance Thrift Store exists. I give God the credit for putting it together with much help from a lot of you people. And I'm still amazed that after existing for 9 years, it not only survived, but it is thriving. When our daughters began stretching, do you want me to keep going? Am I supposed to have a break here?
Good.
Okay.
Finish it.
Okay. When our daughters began stretching their wings and leaving the nest, that was another part of life that took on a deeper dependency upon God, even more than ever. I soon came to realize, though, that he cared for them way better than I ever could. And I love recalling how he provided and protected for them, whether sitting in the airport in Dubai all by herself, or on a lonely stretch of road at night in Ohio, or on the back of a garbage truck in Red Lake. And there's all stories with those. And then came our sons and grandchildren, our sons-in-law. What an awesome part of life this has been for us. We know we don't deserve being this blessed, and yet we accept it as a gift from God. His hand has been upon us, and we know and give him credit. It's just so much fun to get phone calls and hear little people saying, "Hi, Grandma, you have time to talk?" And now they too are spreading their wings and going to other parts of the world to share Jesus' love.
So we're now in a stage that I think is a reflection stage. I use it that way a lot. We have a lot of opportunity for influence as well, and busyness, but it's more of a reflective stage. And I think a lot about life. I think a lot about death. Just yesterday, another sister-in-law of mine was buried, and we couldn't be there. And for ourselves, we're very fortunate in my family of origin and in Rita and my family. We've not yet had a tragic death. I came close to that at least 5 times in my own life, but if you look closely, you'll agree I'm still alive. But now my siblings are dying, and it's a reflective phase of life. And part of it is, and you can look forward to thinking about this if you're not there yet, how do I know what parts of my life have been fruitful? Remember that verse I adopted? You've not chosen me, but I've chosen you to go and bear fruit. And now I look back and think for today and for the past, what parts of my life have been fruitful and what parts didn't bear much fruit, what parts just neutral. But I find this stage of life is probably the best yet. And even though we've been challenged with health issues and fortunately nothing debilitating, but it's possible to be at our age and be loved by kids and grandkids, and to be in good communication. It's possible. At least we can do our best with that. And it's possible. I hope it's inspiring for younger ones to think about, when I'm 71 or 72, will I look back on the fruitful or less fruitful parts of my life with regrets or with thanksgiving? And there's some of both. But I hope our story has been of some help to you. God bless you.